Having access to a wide variety of powerful attacks is quite the boon for a Pokemon, especially in the competitive scene. Considering the importance of move pool variety between different Pokemon, it's only natural to eventually ask the question, what are the best moves in the game? Luckily, Generation 1's unique mechanics makes this question even more interesting. Today, we're going to go over exactly what the best moves in this generation are. And starting off at number 10, we have Rock Slide. This is a rock type move with a base power of 70 and 90% accuracy, and at this point in the series, it has no secondary effects. Far from the flinch menace it is in later generations, Rock Slide started from rather humble beginnings in Generation 1. Not only is it not fully accurate, but Rock Slide has surprisingly low power. Many attacks such as Thunderbolt, Ice Beam, and even the famously mediocre Submission have a higher base power than Rock Slide. With these downsides in mind, you might think that Rock Slide is kind of a terrible move. But there are a few outstanding factors that make Rock Slide a far better move than it first appears. The first is that, in Gen 1, and throughout most of the franchise, Rock is an excellent offensive typing. It hits 4 different types for super effective: Flying, Fire, Ice, and Bug. And while Ice and Bug aren't known for being great defensive types, Flying and Fire pack several surprisingly good resistances. On top of chunking some important types for super effective damage, Rock is also resisted by very few types. The only types that resist Rock today are Fighting, Ground, and Steel didn't exist in Gen 1. On top of that, most fighting types in Generation 1 were severely underpowered. So the number of times your opponent would actually have a resist for your rock type attack was few and far in between. Of course, the most famous attribute of rock type advantage is how it combines with the ground type. These two types cover each other's weaknesses perfectly in the offensive department. Ground is resisted by grass, and Bug can't touch flying at all, while rock can crush bugs and birds easily and can hit grass for neutral damage. The inverse is also mostly true, with none of the types that resist rock resisting ground. This makes rock and ground a very common and powerful set of attacking types to combine with each other, especially in competitive. There's really not much you can switch into against a Pokemon with both Earthquake and Rock Slide without at least taking neutral damage. On top of being a great attacking type, Rock Slide is basically your only option for rock type coverage. The only rock type moves in Generation 1 are Rock Slide and Rock Throw, which is even worse than Rock Slide. Essentially, Rock Slide is a move that's worse than most of the equivalents for other types. But the natural properties of rock types are so good that it's still extremely threatening. The lack of Rock Slide completely ruins multiple otherwise excellent Pokemon. Don't make me trot out the fossils again. While it does have pretty low distribution and most of the Pokemon that learn it aren't that great, the few good Pokemon that can use the move are made terrifying thanks to the offense it offers them. And at number 9, we have Counter. This is a fighting type move with some weird properties. How it works in Gen 1 is that if the last move that hit you was a fighting or normal type move and it dealt damage, it would deal twice that much damage back to your opponent. This is probably surprising to hear for someone familiar with how Counter works in the modern games, as it now reflects damage from any physical move at all. However, in Gen 1, it was restricted to only 2 types of attacks. It also had a very weird quirk, where, instead of using the last move you used this turn to calculate damage, it used the last move your opponent used. So if your opponent used a move you could counter and then switched out or fainted, you could use Counter and still deal damage to their Pokemon. Regardless of this weirdness and how limited the move's use cases were, Counter has still been a very useful move throughout the history of Gen 1's competitive metagame, and can be used in playthroughs to great effect with a little bit of research. Even today, Counter and its eventual special counterpart Mirror Coat can be used to easily defeat trainers in-game. If you want to, you can look up the moveset of your opponent and predict the move that the AI is most likely to use against you and counter or mirror code appropriately. If you wanted to go into a playthrough completely blind, then the move loses a lot of uses. But in challenge playthroughs especially, this is a very valuable tool to have access to, even in Gen 1 where Counter is more limited. Of course, what makes Counter so good and competitive and in Gen 1 overall is that it actually isn't anywhere near as limited as you might think. For some reason, movesets in Gen 1 were just plainfully bad across the board. You'll often be lucky to have even one good move to make use of your stab, or same type attack boost in your entire learn set. However, almost all Pokemon learn a good number of normal type moves, and there are a lot of pretty good attacks in there. As a result, a ton of physical attackers and mixed attackers are forced to run normal type attacks for matchups where their limited stab options aren't all that great. For example, Kabutops mostly relies on Slash to make use of its great physical attack because it just doesn't have any other good physical moves, setting up for easy counters. This gives Counter a lot more room to shine, And that's without even getting to the fact that in Gen 1, several of the absolute best Pokemon in their respective competitive tiers are normal types that want to spam normal stab moves. This has led to certain Pokemon to use the move counter as a powerful counter to these moves. If they aren't able to one-shot with a normal attack, the double damage you deal back will essentially always KO them. This is most pronounced on Chansey, whose massive HP stat and tiny defense stat mean that even relatively weak attacks can be countered for massive damage. While not the main centerpiece of most strategies, counter is such a powerful and unique option that you need to account for it when playing Generation 1. And at number 8, we have Thunder Wave. This is an electric type status move that paralyzes your opponent and is 100% accurate. Thunder Wave has remained an amazing move all the way into the modern day of Pokemon, but in the early days of Gen 1, it was even more powerful. In Generation 6, its accuracy was lower to 90%, but you don't have to worry about that 10% chance to miss in Gen 1. However, the more important aspect is that in Generation 1, paralysis itself was a more powerful status. It used to reduce the Pokemon's speed to a mere quarter of its original value, as opposed to just cutting it in half as it does in later gens. This means that a paralyzed Pokemon is basically never going to outspeed a non-paralyzed Pokemon. It's kind of hard to put into perspective how important going first can be in a battle as well. A lot of competitive games in Gen 1 come down to trying to spread paralysis across your opponent's team to set up for a sweep. A lot of Pokemon in the metagame have the ability to 1 to 2 shot every Pokemon on your opponent's team if they can go first and the team is weakened. And the player who's able to spread paralysis better is the one who will end up sweeping at the end of the game. The sweeping potential is even more potent thanks to moves like Wrap and Low Kick that can flinch your opponent or stop them from moving, but only work if you outspeed your opponent. These moves excel in these late game scenarios where paralysis comes back to bite players. That's not even mentioning the various Pokemon who basically fall apart if they get paralyzed. The likes of Alakazam and other fast, frail attackers lose so much of their utility after paralysis that it's pretty close to just KOing them. While not the absolute best status in Red, Blue, Yellow, spreading paralysis is still incredibly strong, and Thunder Wave is really the only way to reliably spread that status. Even if you're not doing any damage, the power that the status can have on the game makes it far more backbreaking in certain scenarios than even the highest power attacks. Almost any Pokemon that can learn Thunder Wave will run it, or at the very least will consider using it for its incredible utility. And at number 7, we have Body Slam. This is a normal type attack with the base power of 85 and perfect accuracy. It has the secondary effect where 30% of the time it will leave the target paralyzed. Body Slam is one of the most commonly used moves in competitive Generation 1, and it's pretty easy to understand why. It's a move with solid base power and one of the better secondary effects in the game. Causing paralysis is especially relevant in the Generation's competitive metagame for reasons we just covered, and a 30% chance is high enough that a lot of Pokemon use Body Slam as sort of a discount Thunder Wave to fish for paralysis on important targets. This utility far outpaces any other similar normal type attack in the game. Takedown and Double Edge do more damage, but the recoil damage means that you're not trying to hit specific damage regions for specific KOs. They're far riskier to use than Slam is. Thrash does more damage, but it robbing you of control of your Pokemon and confusing you can be really punishing in certain scenarios. Though it does admittedly make the move kinda perfect for speedrunning. Body Slam easily outpaces every option, not only thanks to its more reliable damage, but again, the 30% paralysis chance is one of the best secondary effects on any attack in the game. The best example of how important Body Slam is to Generation 1 competitive specifically is the fallout that followed the discovery of a particular bug in Gen 1. In Generation 1 specifically, Body Slam will never paralyze a normal type Pokemon, which was not known for a long time. Pokemon Showdown, the main way that people play competitive Gen 1, actually had this program incorrectly for a long time, and once this bug was discovered, it had a surprisingly big effect on the metagame. Not being able to fish for paralysis on your opponent's Tauros with Body Slam completely changes how you need to approach a lot of scenarios. The fact that such a niche discovery ended up having that big of an impact really shows just how powerful and widespread the move is. And at number 6, we have Psychic. This is a Psychic type attack with a base power of 90 and perfect accuracy. It has a secondary effect where 1/3 of the time it will drop your opponent's special by 1 stage. Now, the last 2 slots on this list are actually pretty close between a lot of strong, consistent attacks of various types. Moves like Thunderbolt, Flamethrower, Ice Beam, and many other moves for different types are very similar to Psychic and Body Slam in terms of their role and effects in the game. And overall, these moves are of very similar quality. Body Slam and Psychic simply have a couple of attributes that make them stand out above the rest, namely an advantageous typing and broken secondary effect. We already talked about Slam's paralysis, but Psychic's special drop is even more powerful than it is in the modern games. Because special was one stat in Generation 1, dropping your opponent's special both lowered their defense to special moves and lowers their special attack. Combine this with the fact that most Pokemon that are going to be spamming Psychic would have naturally high special stats, and a special drop would not only let you deal massive damage to your opponent next turn, but would also mean that your opponent could no longer do meaningful damage back to you. This means that rolling a special drop often forces your opponent to switch out or just drop to your next attack, both of which are terrible options. On top of the sheer potency of this second effect, there's also the fact that Psychic is an amazing attacking type in Generation 1. While it only deals super effective damage to Poison and Fighting, two types that it's not that valuable to deal double damage to, it's resisted by only Psychic in Generation 1. This means that there's not really much counterplay to just clicking Psychic every turn. In competitive, this means your Psychic spammer can click the move without ever really fearing being checked by a switch. And if you roll the special drop, your opponent switching has probably screwed them. In more casual settings, basically every major battle in the game can be won by a suitably strong Psychic type spamming the move. Psychic is by far the most powerful, consistent damaging move in Gen 1. But unfortunately for it, there are some truly messed up attacks in Gen 1 that it can't compete with. Such as, at number 5, we have Blizzard. This is an Ice type move with 120 base power and 90% accuracy. It also has a 10% chance to freeze the target. And in Gen 1, the only way to thaw out after being frozen is to be hit by a fire type move. Blizzard also has low PP when compared to most moves, only being able to be used 8 times if you use all possible PP ups to get to use the move more. Blizzard belongs to a small category of moves with huge base power, but typically with a pretty big downside. Thunder and Fire Blast both have similar base powers and can cause statuses, but have much lower accuracy, as is the typical way of designing this kind of move all the way into the more modern games. However, for some reason, in Gen 1, Game Freak just forgot to give Blizzard any sort of downside to account for its massive 120 base power, only nerfing its accuracy to 90%, a mostly meaningless downside. This means that, in a lot of scenarios, Blizzard completely outpaces its weaker, consistent counterpart Ice Beam, which is almost never true in later Pokemon games. Basically, every Pokemon that wants to use an Ice-type move and has access to Blizzard will choose Blizzard. There's not really even that much decision to be made when going into it. Blizzard is just obviously better in almost all scenarios. The existence and power of Blizzard makes several Pokemon far scarier than they otherwise would be. Articuno's ability to fire stab blizzards off of its frankly massive special stat gives it a niche and competitive despite not being the best Pokemon overall, and it really wouldn't be an option worth considering if Blizzard weren't so powerful and consistent. We have even mentioned the freeze chance, which is essentially just a 1 in 10 chance to instantly KO your opponent for no reason. Again, you just can't thaw out in Gen 1 without getting hit by a fire type attack, which is so easy for your opponent to play around that if a mon gets frozen, it's never using any other move throughout the rest of the game. Essentially, if you can teach Pokemon Blizzard in a playthrough, you should. It is the single best standard damaging move in the entire game by quite a wide margin. And at number 4, we have Amnesia. This is a Psychic type status move that raises the user's special by 2 stages. A 2-stage boost is equivalent to doubling the affected stat, and getting all the way to a +6 will result in a stat 4 times the original value for anyone who doesn't know. As we mentioned when talking about Psychic, the special attack and defense stat were 1 stat in Gen 1. So Amnesia, rather than effectively having the damage you took from special attacks like it does in the modern games, would do that and also double your damage output in a single turn. This is not only by far the best stat buffing move in Gen 1, it's probably the best stat buffing move ever put into any Pokemon game. Even the infamous Tail Glow, which increased special attack by 3 stages, is given a run for its money by getting so much extra damage and bulk at the same time. The mere existence of this move makes every Pokemon with it an instant threat that you can't allow to stay in play for several turns unanswered. The move was given incredible limited distribution in Gen 1, but every single Pokemon that can learn it can use the move to great effect. Amnesia is only learnable by the Poliwrath line, the Slowbro line, Snorlax, and Mewtwo. All 4 of these Pokemon have sets in competitive built around abusing Amnesia to ruin your opponent's day. In playthroughs, Amnesia is even more broken. The enemy trainer AI is famously abusable, making stat boosting moves, in general, incredible in playthroughs. Amnesia, being the best stat boosting move, is therefore the strongest move to set up sweeps against the game's various bosses. You can pretty easily get through most of the game by using the first Amnesia user you get your hands on and spamming potions on it as you prepare to sweep. It's probably a good thing we never got any other boosting moves that were quite as effective, as the only reason Amnesia isn't super completely over-centralizing in the game's meta is its incredibly low distribution. And at number 3, we have Sleep Powder. This is a grass type move with 75% accuracy that puts your opposing Pokemon to sleep. Even to this day, sleep is an incredibly powerful status effect that can easily determine games. However, in Gen 1, sleep was almost as busted as freeze, basically being an instant KO. Not only could it take up to 7 turns to wake up, but waking up took your entire turn when you finally got around to it. This means that, if your opponent guesses right, they could potentially put you back to sleep right after you wake up, without you even getting the ability to use a move. Sleep's power is slightly mitigated and competitive by the introduction of the Sleep Clause, which makes it so that only one Pokemon on a player's team can be put to sleep at a time. However, even with this restriction, sleep-inducing moves are widespread thanks to just how impactful they can be on the game. Their impact is even larger in playthroughs, where the AI won't switch once they've been slept. This can give you ample terms to set up a sweep with boosting moves like Amnesia, or you can just knock out whatever Pokemon you slept for free afterwards. Thanks to this immense utility, essentially any Pokemon with access to sleep-inducing moves can be used to great effect in a playthrough. A really good benchmark for how good Sleep Powder is the move Hypnosis, which also puts a target to sleep but only had 60% accuracy. Normally, moves this inaccurate would never be worth going for, especially in the competitive side of the game. But Pokemon like Gengar still commonly use the move in the overused tier of Gen 1 because the times you do hit with Hypnosis are simply too devastating. Of course, the absolute best sleep-inducing move in the game is Spore, which has perfect accuracy but can only be used by Parasect, an intentionally terrible Pokemon. It does make Parasect great for filling your decks, though, so keep that in mind if you ever want to catch the full original 151. Sleep Powder is overall the best sleep-inducing move when accounting for who gets access to it, letting it take an official spot on this list, but just about any sleep-inducing move can be a nightmare to deal with. And at number 2, we have Explosion. This is a normal type attack with perfect accuracy and a crazy 170 base power. It also halves your opponent's defenses while it calculates damage, giving it an even higher effective base power of 340. However, it also instantly knocks the user out when they use it. Of course, Explosion does have a sort of sister move in Self-Destruct, which acts identical but only has 130 base power, going up to 260 when accounting for it having their defense. Explosion and Self-Destruct are moves often looked over by the more casual player base, and that makes sense when you consider the limitations in playthroughs. While anything you explode on will likely get knocked out, when you're traversing the game in a playthrough, you're probably going to run into dozens of wild Pokemon on your way to and from each Pokemon Center. Blowing up your Pokemon will only let you deal with one of these many encounters, leaving you with a weakened team for the rest of your trek. Due to being really bad in these kinds of situations, most players skip out on Explosion when building their team. However, Explosion can get a lot of use in a playthrough setting against the major battles. Of course, Explosion's use in this context is still limited. The thing that really gets Explosion onto this list is its use in competitive, where it's an incredible tool to have access to. The sheer burst damage that Explosion provides can allow teams to come back from seemingly impossible scenarios. Pokemon that would normally take a ton of work for multiple members of the team to knock out due to their massive bulk can sometimes be taken out in a single move. Even better, there's no health threshold for when you can and can't use the move. A common scenario is for a Pokemon to have a grueling 1v1 with the Pokemon, barely surviving, and then use Explosion on whatever Pokemon is sent in next, sometimes letting you effectively take down 2 Pokemon with 1 at that point, which wasn't going to contribute anything else to the battle anyway. Of course, there are ways to counter Explosion. Gengar's Ghost typing makes it completely immune to the damage, letting it punish Explosion users heavily with a good prediction. And rock types like Rhydon can often take an Explosion for another, more valuable team member if they're healthy thanks to their normal resist. Still, the fact that these tactics exist kind of shows how powerful Explosion can be in competitive. While it does struggle in the average playthrough when compared to more standard attacks, the fact that Explosion is the singular most powerful attack in the game is too important to ignore, especially in competitive settings. And all the way at number 1, we have Hyper Beam. This is a normal type attack with a perfect accuracy of 150 base power. However, after using the move, the Pokemon has to take a turn off to recharge. At least it normally does. For whatever reason, in Gen 1, if Hyper Beam KOs your opponent, you don't have to recharge for a turn. Hyper Beam is the highest base power move in the game that can be used with any degree of regularity, and the fact that a 150 base power move with a downside that you can get around exists shapes a lot about how red, blue, yellow competitive is played. Part of the reason why spreading paralysis with Thunder Wave is such a big deal is because it helps set up Hyper Beam sweeps. By wearing down the HP of your opponent's Pokemon and eliminating or paralyzing everything faster than your strongest Hyper Beam user, you can set up a checkmate scenario where you just Hyper Beam every single one of your opponent's Pokemon and win the game. This can technically work with any move, but there's no other spammable move in the game with a higher base power as a stab than Hyper Beam, meaning that these sweeps are far easier with Hyper Beam. Even without trying to create a late game sweep, Hyper Beam is still a crazy move. You can take KOs from far higher health totals than other moves, but if your opponent switches to a Pokemon that can tank the beam, then you're stuck recharging for a turn. This makes using Hyper Beam extremely complicated, with heavy predictions and mind games about if your opponent is going to switch, and what they could switch to avoid Hyper Beaming coming into play. Of course, Hyper Beam isn't just one of the most important moves in the competitive scene, it also dunks on basically the entire game. Any semi-decent physical attacker on your team would love to learn Hyper Beam and clean up any wild random Pokemon encounters or trainers that you run into. The only issue with Hyper Beam in Gen 1 playthroughs is its low PP of 5 at base, which can only be upgraded to 8 at most. These downsides are mostly irrelevant though, because Hyper Beam is just one of the most consistent and powerful sources of damage in the game. Pokemon is ultimately about dealing damage to your opponent, and Hyper Beam's almost a non-existent downside makes it the most effective way to deal massive damage in Gen 1.